introducing everybody to the new features. Marco's then going to take about the same amount of time on his demo, should allow us about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. Because of the webinar format, Q&A is either via the chat or preferably the Q&A button in Zoom. Either way, either of those, just get your questions in as we're going through, and then we'll just read through them at the end. Okay, so our agenda today, we're just going to first of all talk about the release and basic information about it. We're then going to dive straight in and look at the features that Marco and I think are the most significant ones. We're not looking at every new feature in Apache CloudStack 4.18. We've just cherry-picked the stuff that we think is really interesting. So we're going to talk about edge zones, the new integration with Tungsten Fabric SDN platform, new auto-scaling functionality, managed user data, and then the two-factor authentication framework and the specific TOTP authenticator we have for that. They're probably what we consider the headline features. We're then going to go through some smaller features, which are, they're just as important, but we've sort of classified them almost as tier 2, if you like. So encryption of volumes, API-driven console access, and a new global settings UI and adaptive affinity groups. Okay, so the release itself, Apache CloudStack 4.18 isn't actually released yet. It will be released imminently. Here we are today on the 8th of March, 2023, within a few days. It's in voting at the moment on the dev mailing list. It's the third round of voting, so expect an announcement at any time. It's been a massive effort across the entire community, lots of different contributors to this release, months and months and months of work. And the culmination is, in total, 275 new features, improvements, and bug fixes, which is about in line with what most major CloudStack releases are around that sort of scale. 21 new significant features. I think we're going to talk about 12 of them here today, but there are some more. 4.18 is an LTS release, which means the community will engage and support around 4.18 for 18 months. So that takes us up to roughly September 2024. So let's start looking at some of these features. So edge zones, edge computing. Everybody's been talking about it for some time. I'm sure everybody knows the basic concepts. But this is about, moving compute, moving processor power down to the edge, out into distributed environments. And there's always been this thing with CloudStack. CloudStack is a brilliant orchestrator from a data center or multiple data center perspectives, but it's never really easily been able to actually deploy stuff out into edge locations. And if you think about edge locations, they can be manufacturing plants, they can be autonomous vehicles, they can be point of sale systems, distribution warehouses, instrumentation, they can be anything. And what we're talking about here is the ability of Apache CloudStack to actually manage deployments of compute, of processing power out into the edge, as well as in data centers. Because the classic thing is, if you look at the classic model there of CloudStack with its core zones, all of those edge locations have got a lot of latency in between them. Data needs to move into the data center constantly, so it makes sense to change that, have these things called edge zones where the processing can be done out at the edge. So CloudStack introduces this concept of an edge zone, and that's a lightweight zone construct, very similar concept to the existing zones, which, by the way, have now been renamed core zones. So we now have two zone types. We have core zones and we have edge zones. And that construct for edge zones has been heavily stripped back to just have effectively the bare minimum, most lightweight things that could go in it could go in a zone to make it operable, to make it support compute, to make it support networking and storage. It doesn't support things like shared storage, external switching. It has a very basic networking model out at the edge. There's no secondary storage VMs, etc., and it only supports shared and layer 2 networks and the KVM hypervisor. because let's face it, nobody's going to want to start deploying VMware hosts out into the edge. So we end up now with our zones in CloudStack being a mix of, if you see there, the third column, core zones and edge zones. And the zone creation wizard now has two distinct workflows to go through, depending on whether you're creating a core zone or whether you're creating an edge zone. Marco's going to demo all of this, and obviously you can see there on the right, when you then deploy an instance, you can choose to deploy an instance out to a particular edge zone. Okay, next major new feature is integration with Tungsten Fabric. Tungsten Fabric was formerly Open Contrail. It came out of Juniper initially. They then open sourced it, gave it to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's become Tungsten Fabric. Tungsten Fabric is an SDN platform which gives you management, control, ease of operations of your networking environment. It's software-defined networking. CloudStack historically has had integration with other SDN platforms. We had integration with Nicira, but of course that's proprietary. This is the first time we've got integration with an open source SDN platform. So we've now integrated it with CloudStack. What it basically allows you to do, in summary, from a user perspective, consumer of CloudStack, nothing changes. They would have no idea that Tungsten had been implemented. But what is actually happening is when they are managing their networks, whether they're setting port forwarding rules, firewall rules, et cetera, that's not being managed with a CloudStack virtual router. That's being managed through Tungsten Fabric and its overlays. And then that brings into play for the operator, whether it's service provider or enterprise, brings into play things like policy-driven networking, and all of these amazing things that an SDN platform has can all effectively be combined with CloudStack's self-service networking model. It's developed as a plugin. This work, I'm going to call these people out by name, but ENA over in the US and eWork were the two organizations who collaborated on this. This has been a massive piece of work. I think there was hope that it might have got into a previous version of CloudStack, but it's finally ready. And they've created this plugin, which replaces the CloudStack virtual router. It's implemented at zone level. So you can have different zones, some with traditional CloudStack networking, some with Tungsten, and the user experience in terms of networking is identical. So, whatever it is, you're setting up port forwarding, setting up firewall rules, whatever, a user just goes and uses the same screens in CloudStack as they would if Tungsten wasn't there. We sort of configure it during creation of a zone. So we create a zone, we choose an isolation method that is Tungsten, and then the zone creation wizard asks for a lot of information, Tungsten provider, gateway, et cetera, to actually then plug the plugin into the Tungsten controller itself. Marco's going to demo this later. There are some things it doesn't do, and I think this is purely around scale. This is a very, very big piece of integration, and at this stage, it's got most common use cases covered. Few things missing. VPC, for example, is not supported. You would need to use CloudStack Virtual Router for that. VPN isn't yet supported. I've got a feeling, based on the amount of interest I've seen out there in the community and more generally, I've got a feeling some of these extra features or missing features are going to come along quite quickly in CloudStack. Okay, next up is CloudStack Autoscaling, and we've had autoscaling in CloudStack for a long time. In fact, we were talking about this morning. I think it's like nearly a decade we've had autoscaling in Apache CloudStack. But the autoscaling we've always had has relied on a third-party piece of third-party hardware, and it's no secret. It specifically needed a Citrix NetScaler because it was some code that Citrix gave when they were involved in the CloudStack project. And to be frank, it hasn't been widely adopted, and the code around the existing autoscaling hasn't really had a lot of love and hasn't been maintained. This functionality is all new, and it is native auto-scaling functionality in Apache CloudStack. It's completely native, no need for anything third-party hardware or software. It works across every hypervisor. It uses a wide or it can use a wide range of metrics to trigger the auto scaling, and it's got a concept of policies. I'm going to talk you through those in a second. You can specify interval, wait periods, everything you would expect in auto scaling functionality, and it can be used in the UI and the API. So from a user's perspective, there is a new construct. It's a new main menu command in the CloudStack UI called an auto-scale group. And an auto-scale group is a collection of these 6 things you see there. So first of all, it has to be in a specific zone. You have to give it a template, because what this auto-scaling group is going to do is scale up instances, scale up compute as demand increases. So you give it a template on which to base that. That has to be based on a specific compute offering. So, you know, how many vCPUs, how much memory every time it scales. It has a set of policies configured for both scale up and scale down. It has to be associated with a load balancer, because you would obviously have a load balancer in front of something when you're creating more instances. And optionally, you can give it a data disk. And the autoscale group then decides how many instances. It creates new instances as demand increases. It removes instances in that group as demand decreases. So we create these policies. Marco's going to talk us through this in more detail in his demo. You've got loads of metrics you can use: instance CPU, memory, total connections on the load balancer, network traffic. The instance metrics are gathered from the underlying hypervisor. So CloudStack is actually talking to the hypervisor to find out CPU utilization, memory of particular instances. And then the network metrics come from the virtual router. You can add multiple scale up and scale down policies. So you can have a policy based on bandwidth. You can have a policy based on, you know, processor utilization or what have you. And if you have multiple policies, multiple metrics in one group, they're an and situation. So you might say, you know, scale this group when average CPU is above 50%, and I've got more than 50 load balancer connections. If you want to do OR conditions, then you just create multiple groups. So everything's possible with this. There's also a whole range of advanced things you can set. You can set how quickly it expunges instances, how often it polls, how dynamic you want it to be, what your minimum number of members are, your maximum number of members, and yeah, that's it. Marco will talk us through that in the demo. Okay, so that's auto scaling. Next new feature is managed user data, CloudStack managed user data. And user data is that piece of cloud init we use at first boot to get instance specific data down. So, you know, that instance specific data might be some configurations you want, names of things. It might be telling it to go and run some scripts, go and run Ansible playbooks to deploy software. It might just be telling it to just install some updates. But a good percentage of instances deployed across with CloudStack globally are going to be using user data. And up to this point, user data has basically just been a blob of text stored with a virtual machine. What this new functionality does is organize that. It effectively creates a library for user data. So user data scripts can be stored there, but you can see them on the menu. You can create as many as you want. You can link them to one another, etc. You then associate them with a template, an ISO, or even a specific instance. And this mechanism also supports custom parameters. So you can use it to pass parameters at the time of deployment. It's just organizing the whole concept of user data in Apache CloudStack. So there's an example there of that's editing a template and then choosing the user data entry that you want to use, and even do things like you can specify whether at the point of instance creation, whether it's going to be allowed to be overridden or not, or appended, etc., etc. And there's a simple example there of what's that doing. Installing MariaDB by the looks of it. Okay, two-factor authentication. This is a long time coming for CloudStack, and really there's two sort of features here. We've got a two-factor authentication framework, and then a specific provider for time-based OTP. So 2FA, obviously everybody knows, is about a second factor as well as a password. Lots of different organizations want to use lots of different authentication techniques. You know, some people are happy with just an SMS-based thing. A lot of people now want to use TOTP authenticators, sometimes a very specific TOTP authenticator. So the approach here was to create a framework to allow people to use whatever sort of authenticators they want. So the framework is basically implemented to allow people to then create plugins specifically for the authentication technique they want to use. Obviously provides an extra layer of authentication, protects against phishing, brute force attacks. From a CloudStack perspective, it can be enabled for an individual user, domain, or globally. And importantly, it can then be enforced for an individual user, a domain, or globally by somebody with the appropriate permissions to do so. So you can literally, as a root admin or cloud admin, you can go and say, right, across this entire instance, I'm going to enforce 2FA. The next time everybody logs on, they're going to be taken through the setup screens to configure 2FA on their account and not allowed to log on until they've done that. That's a pluggable framework. Operators can create new authentication providers. There's two at the moment. The one I'm going to talk you through in a second, and there's also a very simple one, which I think is called something like secondary PIN or something, which, to be frank, isn't probably something people use in production, but very good for testing. You can put multiple providers in the same environment, so you can choose different subsets of domains or users who have to authenticate using one technique or another technique. So the second feature related to this is the TOTP plugin. And this is one of the plugins to the framework. It's the first one, if you like, the provider to the framework. And this will support anything that supports the TOTP protocol. So that's, there's a wide list: Microsoft, Google Authenticator, KeyPass, free OTP, loads of different apps available. Anything that supports that protocol, this plugin will actually support. Okay, volume encryption. You can now fully encrypt at disk level root or data volumes in Apache CloudStack. This is configured from a disk offering or compute offering. We're talking about root disk. You literally say, there's a checkbox there, encrypt, and those volumes will be encrypted. It uses LUX1, which is been around for some time in the Linux world. Pretty standard cipher, and you can use it. Above it, it will support NFS, local, shared mount point, scale IO, whatever. This is only for KVM. This at this stage is only supported for the KVM hypervisor. API-driven console access. So this came about from some sort of requirements of certain organizations to want to use the CloudStack console and its method of proxying console access in the secure way it does, but use that in external systems. And I think that, a simple example of this is you may well have a help desk system. That help desk system might actually be supporting the CloudStack cloud environment, or it might be supporting something else. And from that system, your users want to be able to click a button and say, okay, give me console access. Now, CloudStack's got all the capability. It uses the console proxy to do that, and it does it in a very secure way. But there's been no way of accessing that externally, because when you click the button traditionally in the CloudStack UI to say console, it literally has opened a web page with the console embedded in it. What now happens when you call the API is it returns a URL which will give you console access. Okay, that URL can then be read into an external system or done with anything you want to do with to display the console. There's quite a few security measures around this. It's a use once URL to stop replay attacks. It's got some extra token-based security checks. I'm not going to go into all of those now. And it also has some sort of token-based handshaking mechanism, so the external system and CloudStack are aware of each other and can pass around parameters and that sort of thing. But basically, if you call the API command, I think it's get console access now, it returns a URL to you on the API. You can then do with that URL whatever you want, third-party systems in a browser or whatever. Okay, adaptive affinity groups. So traditionally with CloudStack, with both affinity groups and anti-affinity groups, our model has been a strict model. So you say to CloudStack, right, I want to keep these two instances together with an affinity group. It deploys the first one, it goes to deploy the second one. If there's not enough resources on that host, the deployment would just fail. CloudStack is strict. It said, no, I've got to do these together. I'm not going to deploy the second one. We can now, with both affinity and anti-affinity, we can specify whether we want them to be strict or non-strict. If it's strict, it's going to behave exactly the same way as before. We'll only deploy if it's able to meet the rule of the affinity group or the anti-affinity group. Now, if you say non-strict, it will try to meet that rule. If it can't, it will then deploy it somewhere else. So it just gives more flexibility around affinity groups. Finally, last thing I'm going to talk about today. I mean, this is not a major new feature, but it's one of my favorite things. Finally, there's a new global settings user interface in Apache CloudStack. For years, we've had a very, very simple key value pair, very searchable, very easy to use, actually. But some time ago, a few people commented, I think it's on the mailing list or something, that actually it's quite intimidating. There's just hundreds of settings. And if you don't know, if you're new to CloudStack, you can't find your way around these things. You don't know what half of these settings are. So now there's just some hierarchy, some order. There's, nice Boolean sliders and all sorts of stuff just to make the global settings UI just more friendly, probably for new operators, new adopters of CloudStack. That is everything I want to talk about today. I am going to hand over to Marco shortly. He's going to demo, hopefully, the new auto-scaling functionality, Tungsten edge zones, manage user data, and two-factor authentication. Am I correct, Marco?
Yeah, exactly. Let me go to the demo right now. Well, Joyce, the first thing you show with the autoscaling, because you need time to stress the system and everything, though. So here I am logged as a user, as a regular user into the CloudStack. And let's go to the computing autoscale group so I can add a new. The way is, just to show first, it's I have already a network ready here. If I get this public address, I have already a load balance here to create a new autoscale group. So let's go there and let's create an autoscale group to stress it after. Let me get some value here. Duration 10 seconds, quiet time 10 seconds too. And select, I have a range of counters here. So I will select load balancer for the demo. And the threshold is a 2 simultaneous connection to scale up. Okay, so it's here. If I want, for example, to use another counter, I can select it, for example, VM CPU 70%, and then both will be considered, and then will be used and load balance in VM CPU. So let's define the policy for scale down. The same here, 10 seconds. And load balancer also need to be less than 2 connections. So I have it here. As I wanted to stress some web server in that case, I will deploy some applications here. to show how it works scaling. My application is very simple. You will install HTTP server. You do make some changes in the Apache HTTP server. And so I have a Python script here, sleep in 5 seconds to simulate a 5-second connection, sleep connection into the server. And so I will print the host name at the end and enable the service and start it. Let me get some name here. Expulsion 10, maximum number 10. Normally in production, you use a choose server to start auto-scale group, for example. Then I use the same number here too. And poly interval.
Marco, it's just worth mentioning. I'll highlight it before anybody else does. You've just specified your user data there to deploy your application, right? And that's actually the old user data mechanism you're using, because we've got the new managed user data. And just to let everybody know, because of the timing of these two features, the new managed user data UI hasn't come into the Autoscale functionality yet. It's everywhere else. So that was something that will come through in a following release.
Yeah, exactly, Giles. That's it. So let's create it. Need to wait a little bit to create the instance and the rules inside CloudStack. So here you are. If you go to instance, it's the original instance I have here to maintain the network running. Just a second. Here we are. The first instance is starting right now. Let's wait for the second one because I set 2 instances as a minimal. Here it is.
So there's no load on the load balancer yet. This is simply because you said a minimum of 2, right?
Exactly, Giles. That's it. So let me access the application here. It's not red. It's unavailable because I needed to wait the virtual machine starts. Okay. So let's talk a little bit when the virtual machine, the instance are starting. Let's talk about the edge zones just to show how it works as admin, to show the zones here. So as you can see here in the zone, you have 2 types of zone right now. The core zones and the edge zones is the same, just you can add a new zone, you have this selector to select if you build a core zone or an edge zone. And that's it. It's very simple. It's the same way you can build. It's simple than a core zone. So it's
the core zones are what we used to just call zones, right? But
exactly.
They've been renamed core.
Before it's zone. Exactly, James. Yeah. Let's back to Autoscale as a regular user here to check if the instances are running right now. Checking here the console. Well, it's booting. I think now will deploy the application. That's it.
So that's your user data running.
My user data, it's consumed by Cloud Init right now. It's done. If I back to this page, it's unavailable. Now it will sleep for 5 seconds, and then you return the instance name here. That's it. If I reload it once, just to check if the load balancer is working, 5 seconds. I think the second instance is not ready yet. Let me take a look here. It's red. So, yeah, it's the one here. The one.
Okay, so your Autoscale group has created the 2 instances. You map those to the load balancer. Great. That's 2 instances and a load balancer. How about if it gets under load?
Well, let me. I use the Apache AB from HTTP server, so to run 2 concurrent connections here. Okay, just to stress it, you need some time, to scale it. During this time, you need to wait to create more virtual machine during the auto scaling. Let's talk a little bit about the Tungsten fabric.
Okay.
Okay. So, as you can see here, everything is the same to navigate. You have egress rule is the same. The public IP address. It's very important. We don't have a virtual router like when you use the traditional CloudStack with traditional network.
So this is a zone configured with Tungsten underneath it already, right?
Exactly. It is. Let me show here. It's
okay.
Isolation method here is a Tungsten fabric.
Okay, get it.
Okay, that's it. So let's back to the network. Let's configure something to show it reflecting in the Tungsten fabric controller. So let me back it here. Wait, public IP address, the handler. I don't have any firewall rules here. Okay, let me put some thing here. Let me enable SSH port here. So here, let me do a port forwarding here to a VM I already have here deployed. And let's create also a load balancer. With this instance here.
Now, normally CloudStack would be sending those commands down to the virtual router, right? But there are no virtual routers here.
Yeah, you got it, Giles. That's it. So let's go to the Tungsten Fabric UI. This is the Tungsten Fabric UI. Let's go to setup here for networking. Let's take a look in the networks. Well, you have here my network, the network I have already in the CloudStack, a public network, a management network. It's the same of a traditional VR using, And for example, for my network, I have associated here and a policies, this policy here, 211. If I go to the policies, so I can see everything. For example, here in the public network, I have the 22 port already enabled.
Yeah.
Okay, and now so the 211 here, I have, for example, as in the CloudStack, back to the CloudStack, just to show it. As I have here, the egress rules, it's by default is allow. Then Tungsten reflects the same in the CloudStack. And now, so load balance, for example, I have here with the instance, for example, I am running internal IP address and the public one floating IP.
Okay, and the plugin, the Tungsten plugin to CloudStack has done all of this. You haven't pre-configured any of this.
Exactly that, Giles. That's it. So let's back to the autoscaling to see what's happened here. Wow, here, Giles, you have a lot of virtual machines, as I am stressing. So you need to scale down this. Let me kill this process. And let's talk about the managed user data. Okay, when it's scaled down the instance here. So it's important to say that only admin can manage these the user data, the managed user data scripts. Okay, if you go through compute and then user data, I have some user data listed here. Also, you can, for example, if you get a template, this CentOS, and edit it, you can say that to associate and manage your user data with a template, for example. In the future, and also the link policy you can use, for example, for override, append, or deny override. Okay, so just to simulate here, if I add an instance, here in advanced mode, if I select, for example, MariaDB server, I have here some parameters to send using the user data to, for example, configure my database inside, okay? The root password I'm doing here, the database user I want to create, and the bay user password, for example. That's it. So I have here just running a MariaDB server. It's completely ready. For example, I define when I create a virtual machine user, I set a password. So, and I create this DB. That's it. It's ready. It's deployed and configured by manage user data. So, and let's talk now. Let me log out again and log in as user. Let's talk about the two-factor authentication and TOTP. Okay, if you user go to the profile, there is this new button here on top to set up the user two-factor authentication. So when the user click on this, they can select, for example, the plugin the provider you want. For example, TOTP authenticator. Let's set up it. We'll show this QR code. Then you need to use an application, something like, can you see this? Microsoft, okay?
So we'll let everybody know, Marco was going to do this with an authenticator on his desktop, but then he discovered that authenticators on desktops don't like being shared on Zoom. So he's having to do it on his phone.
I think it's possible to see it's configured. It's ready. I need to copy this code and, for example, insert it here. Oops. And verify it's set. Then I can log out and let's try to log in with the user again. We'll ask now the password. I will insert something wrong here just to fail. So if the user don't have, for example, the right code, it's impossible to authenticate here. Let's log in again. That's it, Giles. And take a look here, Giles. It's possible to see instance stopping to because of the scale group. It is scaling down the instance here. That's it. Demo ready.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marco. That's fantastic. We've moved really quickly, bearing in mind we've got such exciting new features. There aren't actually many questions, bearing in mind how many people there are on this webinar. We haven't got that many questions. So those of you still listening, please send your questions through. We've got plenty of time. Okay, so let's start looking at some of these. Liridan. Are there some backup codes which can be provided if the 2FA devices get lost? Marco, do you want to answer this one?
Just a second, Jay. Sorry.
Did you hear that?
Can you repeat? Let me see the question here. Wait a minute. It's Also, where is the button?
Oh, sorry, it's the
Q&A here. I found it. I have a question about the resource limit. We have a severe type of user. Okay, how can I limit by specific this type of user account? For example,
no, Marco. Sorry, I was asking. I was asked a different question. Let me answer this. Yes, the backup codes, I believe, are provided by the individual providers. Actually, exactly how that's implemented, I don't know. Liridan, if you drop your contact details in, we will follow up with you and let you know. So question about limits. Yeah, Dimitri, question about resource limits. We've not actually relevant to any of the new functionality today. Somebody's already suggested it. Go to the CloudStack users mailing list and lots of people will help you with that there. How does Tungsten Fabric compare to VMware NSX? So first of all, it's open source and it won't cost you millions of dollars. I think it really is actually a significant thing. And obviously from a CloudStack perspective, hypervisor independence is really important. It's one of the use cases around CloudStack. And that's partly, I think, what's driven this work around Tungsten, is having a good open source alternative. From a functionality and performance perspective, I think there's lots of benchmarking published between the two. If you listen to VMware, they'll say one thing. If you listen to Juniper, they'll say another thing. But both of these technologies, I know, are in pretty widespread production deployment. I don't know, Marco, have you got anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think using, for example, Tungsten, you have end-to-end open source solution. It's, as you told, it's reduce the cost. In terms of performance, the result from many users using Tungsten is very positive. It's very, very much better than using, for example, virtual router. You know, it's a really good platform to use as SDN.
Yeah. So there's a question that a few different people have asked. Will two-factor authentication work with SAML? Sorry, SAML 2. I think it does, and that's embarrassing. I don't know that off the top of my head, because I think it's implemented as a complete secondary authentication layer on top of whatever authentication somebody's using. So is SAML as Active Directory or just CloudStack old-fashioned passwords? Am I right there, Marco?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So you can combine SAML 2 and CloudStack.
Yeah, for sure. It's the second one. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Okay, so yeah, we're getting a lot of very generic questions. How does the CloudStack usage server work? There's loads out published. Unless, actually, I'm thinking, is that relevant to anything here? I mean, that question may be in relation to autoscaling, which would make it a very relevant question. So yeah, I mean, as instances are scaled up by the autoscale group, those instances are going to be recorded in the usage database. Because if you're a service provider, it doesn't matter, you don't care whether your users are creating instances manually or scripting them through the API or using autoscale groups. So yeah, those instances will be recorded in the CloudStack usage database. And that's actually explains why there's sort of a lot of protection around that, you know, the maximum members, the minimum members, the polling intervals, because people will want to tweak these autoscale groups to balance, you know, having enough resources to meet demand with the cost or the perceived cost of those things. So I hope that question was in relation to autoscale groups. If it's not, I apologize. Okay, let's look through some of these. Any more questions to come in at all, guys? Okay, no, that looks like it. So I think we'll wrap up there. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. We'll just quickly share our contact details if anybody wants to get in touch.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So
please feel free to reach out to me or to Marco directly. watch for announcements to say the release of Apache CloudStack 4.18 is imminent. Watch for announcements on social, on the CloudStack website. And please do get into the users mailing list and give the community your feedback. But that's it from me and Marco. Goodbye, everybody.